In the spring of 1945, Berlin was preparing for the end. What was once the center of Nazi power was about to crumble. Soviet troops, after advancing unchecked from the east, were already facing the Oder, ready to take the capital. The Reich had run out of allies, out of reinforcements, and out of options. That empire, which years before seemed invincible, now barely resisted with improvised lines, contradictory orders, and a fear that covered everything. In the beginning, everything was different. Germany had conquered Poland, France, and half of Europe in record time. Only the United Kingdom resisted. With that momentum, Hitler decided to attack the USSR with the idea of a quick victory. But the winter, the terrain, and the Red Army halted the advance. Moscow did not fall, and the front line began to retreat. What followed was a constant, long, and bloody retreat that ended in the streets of Berlin. While Stalin pointed everything towards that city, convinced that the control of the capital would define the order that would come next, Berlin was sinking amidst ruins, silence, and resignation. How were those last days really lived inside the capital of the Reich? Stalin's silent plan. Yalta sealed Berlin's fate before the first shot. In the first days of February of 1945, the leaders of the main Allied powers met in a deteriorating palace near the coast of the Black Sea. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Iosif Stalin shared a table in Livadia to try and define how Europe would be reorganized once the war ended. The Yalta Conference not only sought to establish conditions for peace, but it also exposed the tensions between allies, the particular interests, and the fears about what would come next. Although consensus was officially sought, individual intentions marked the dynamic of the conversations, and in the case of the Soviet leader, his gaze was fixed on a city that had become a symbol of enemy power: Berlin. Stalin had arrived at Yalta with a solid position. His Red Army was advancing unstoppably from the east, and his troops were already close to the heart of Germany. For him, the fall of Berlin was not just a military goal, but a matter of political prestige. He wanted to secure Soviet control over the capital of the Third Reich before the British and American forces had an opportunity to enter. It was not a race based solely on military strategy, but a competition for the symbolic control of Europe. During the discussions, Churchill tried to limit the Soviet Union's advance into Central Europe. He was especially concerned about the fate of Poland, the country for which the United Kingdom had entered the war, and which now fell within the Soviet area of influence. Roosevelt, more focused on obtaining Stalin's cooperation for the future United Nations organization, adopted a more conciliatory stance. This gave the Soviet leader enough room to maneuver politically and reinforce his authority over the territories occupied by his army. In that context, Berlin became the priority objective for Stalin. During the meetings, he did not openly insist that his army would arrive first, but his interventions were loaded with references to the need to eliminate all Nazi resistance from its origin. He considered that the only way to guarantee a post-war order favorable to the Soviet Union was to control the city from day one. Although he did not say it directly, his plan was clear. Berlin had to fall under Soviet dominion. The structure of the division of occupation zones was discussed carefully. Soviet forces would obtain control of the eastern part of Germany, while the British and Americans would divide the west. France, which had not been invited to the negotiations, would receive a sector later. Although the map was divided with pencil and rulers on a blueprint, Stalin knew that paper was only the first step. The physical presence of troops in each zone would define the reality. For this reason, his political pressure for the Red Army to reach Berlin as soon as possible was not only a logistical priority, but a meticulous calculation about the real power he would have at the end of the war. The climate of the conversations was tense. At several moments, Churchill expressed his frustration with what he considered excessive concessions to the Soviets. Roosevelt, although physically weakened, tried to maintain balance. Stalin, for his part, appeared calm and calculating. His goal was to get the Allies to officially accept what was already happening in fact, Soviet dominance over Eastern Europe. He knew that with each passing day, his army was getting closer to Berlin, and that strengthened his position at the negotiating table. Parallel to the formal conversations, Soviet military advisors had already drawn preliminary lines for a final assault on the German capital. Although the operational details would be refined later, Stalin's political intention was evident. While the Western leaders spoke of democratic principles and free elections, he was consolidating his power through territorial occupation. For the Soviet leader, victory was measured not in words or diplomatic compromises, but in the amount of territory his divisions could control. One of the most delicate points was the future of Poland. Churchill pressed for the recognition of the Polish government in exile, while Stalin defended the authority of the pro-Soviet regime established in Lublin. The discussion lasted for hours, but in the end, the Soviet leader's vision prevailed. This served as an indication of how other similar issues would be resolved. The one with the most power on the ground would decide, and that included, of course, Berlin. Stalin's obsession with the capital of the Third Reich had multiple dimensions. On a political level, he needed to demonstrate that the Soviet Union was the true victor of the war in Europe. On an ideological level, he wanted to completely eliminate the image of Nazism from its epicenter, and on a symbolic level, he intended to make the capture of Berlin an act that would mark the beginning of a new era under his influence. To achieve this, he was willing to move all necessary resources, regardless of the cost. During the Yalta sessions, the Soviet leader mentioned on several occasions the need for a quick and definitive response against Germany. Although he did not give concrete deadlines, his statements were aimed at justifying future unilateral actions. He was clear that if the Red Army stopped or advanced slowly, he would lose the advantage over his allies. For this reason, upon returning from Crimea, he gave precise orders to accelerate the offensive, with his gaze fixed on the main objective. In the days following the conference, the Soviet propaganda apparatus began to prepare the ground to justify the operation. In the media controlled by the regime, there was talk of the historical responsibility of the Soviet people in liberating Europe from fascism. The suffering of civilians under Nazi occupation was highlighted, and the idea was reinforced that only the Soviet Union could guarantee a future without war. In that framework, the attack on Berlin appeared as an inevitable mission. The Soviet leadership also sought to ensure internal support for the offensive. Although the fighting had been devastating, celebrations were organized for the recent victories, decorations were distributed, and heroic figures of the Red Army were elevated. Everything was aimed at keeping the morale of the troops high and justifying the sacrifices that would come in the following months. Stalin did not doubt that the cost would be enormous, but he was convinced that the prize was worth it. From a diplomatic perspective, the Soviet leader played his cards with precision. Instead of openly rejecting the proposals of Roosevelt or Churchill, he molded them in his favor. He spoke of collaboration, but always from a position of strength. He accepted certain formal compromises while consolidating his real interests through military advance. Thus, Berlin ceased to be just a target on a map to become the endpoint of a coldly calculated strategy. Although the Yalta Conference did not conclude with an explicit plan for the capture of the German capital, all the elements were already arranged. Stalin had managed to legitimize his presence in Eastern Europe, had obtained key concessions on the occupation zones, and had generated the political framework that allowed him to justify a determined advance toward Berlin. The military preparations would advance soon, but the victory began to be defined in those diplomatic meetings. When the delegations said goodbye in Crimea, many of the agreements were still open to interpretation. However, the Soviet leader had something more valuable than legal clarity. He had the advantage of the terrain, control of the routes, and the backing of an army that would not stop. For Stalin, history would not be written in treaties but in conquered ruins, and Berlin was the key to closing that page. With his return to Moscow, the priorities were marked. The political strategy was already delineated. The next step would be to put it into practice with a final offensive. The city that once represented the absolute power of Nazism was now transforming into the definitive goal of a silent plan, carefully traced but executed with decision. Race of Titans, Zhukov and Konev dispute Berlin with blood and fire. During the days following the Yalta Conference, Stalin returned to Moscow with a fixed idea. The time had come to act. The diplomatic phase had served to secure the geopolitical framework, but the real control of Berlin depended on the speed and determination of the military advance. From the first dispatches in the Kremlin, the order was clear. The German capital had to be reached as soon as possible. To fulfill that objective, Stalin relied on two of his most experienced and ambitious generals, Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev. Both had the recognition of the Soviet leader, but they also shared a rivalry marked by competition and the desire for prominence. Each was assigned a route of advance toward Berlin. Zhukov would command the 1st Belarusian front, while Koniev would lead the 1st Ukrainian front. The geography, however, placed both on a line of possible convergence upon the German capital, which soon became a field of tacit dispute. Although outwardly working toward the same objective, each sought to be the first to raise the Soviet flag over the heart of the Third Reich. This competition, fueled by Stalin's pressure, led to hasty decisions and offensives with high human cost. The terrain on the outskirts of Berlin presented formidable obstacles. One of the most fortified areas was the Silo Heights, east of the capital. Zhukov, determined to advance quickly, ordered a frontal assault on April 16, 1945. Despite having a significant numerical superiority, his troops encountered unexpectedly strong resistance from the German defences. The marshy terrain, added to a thick fog and deficient preparation in some sectors, made coordination difficult and slowed the advance. That attack, far from being a quick victory, became one of the costliest episodes in terms of lives lost. Meanwhile, Koniev advanced from the south, taking advantage of the lower concentration of enemy troops on his route. His front managed to overcome the defences with greater speed and began to move toward the southwest of the city. Stalin, observing the development of both offensives, fueled the rivalry by allowing the two generals to compete openly for entry into Berlin. He established no clear area limits nor ordered strict coordination, which reinforced the tension and sense of urgency between the two commands. The casualty figures during these days were alarming. Although the exact number varied between sources, there was talk of tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers killed or wounded just in the attempt to break through the Silo Heights. Zhukov, pressured by the political and military calendar, maintained the offensive until a significant breach was achieved. However, the cost was so high that even within the high command, the decisions made during those battles were discussed. Despite everything, the general retained Stalin's backing, as he valued results above the methods employed. In parallel, reports from Koniev's front indicated sustained progress. The speed with which his units advanced generated concern in Zhukov's camp, who feared being relegated at the most symbolic moment of the campaign. This pressure transferred to the field officers, who intensified their attacks and forced movements without adequate planning. The idea that the first to reach Berlin would be inscribed in history as the definitive victor of the war in Europe weighed on every decision. The Soviet command structure, despite its rigidity, allowed certain degrees of local initiative. This meant that middle-level commanders had to make rapid decisions in chaotic situations, often without full communication with the upper levels. The result was an offensive that, although effective in its territorial advance, was marked by improvisation and brutality. As the troops approached the outskirts of the capital, the rivalry between fronts intensified. In Moscow, Stalin received constant reports on the progress of his generals. Although he officially did not lean toward either, his comments hinted at a certain preference for whoever achieved the most visible results. That ambiguity functioned as an incentive for both fronts to continue their march without pause. For the Soviet leader, speed was essential. Every day that passed increased the risk of Western forces closing the gap from the west. Despite the previous agreements, he knew that effective control of the city depended on who occupied it first. On the operational maps, the routes to Berlin crossed and overlapped. Soviet units, in many cases, were unclear about the limit of action for each front. This caused operational friction and even some minor confrontations between formations of the same army. However, the urgency to reach the common goal maintained the focus on the main objective. The advance continued, and the German defences, although resistant at key points, began to crumble under the constant pressure. On April 19th, after several days of uninterrupted combat, Zhukov finally managed to overcome the Silo Heights. The road to Berlin lay open from the east. Koniev, for his part, had reached the banks of the Spree River from the south. Both fronts were now in positions from which they could launch the final assault. Although there was still fighting to be done, especially in the peripheral areas, the fall of the city was a matter of days. In those days, the tension within the Soviet High Command increased. There were discussions about who had the right to coordinate the final movements, who would report first to Moscow, and what the official narrative would be that would be disseminated after the victory. Although the priority was the definitive defeat of the enemy, in practice every decision was loaded with personal and political implications. Stalin knew this and allowed it. The competition between Zhukov and Konev, far from being a problem, was one more tool to accelerate the conquest of Berlin. That final stretch of the offensive was a combination of military strategy, personal ambition, and political pressure. There was no margin for error or time for doubt. Each general wanted to be the first to cross the finish line, and they knew that the judgment of history would depend on those last steps. The routes were traced, the battalions in motion, and the German capital ever closer. What began as an offensive planned from the offices had transformed into a race of no return between two titans of the Soviet army. The Ghost Army, the foreign volunteers who sustained Berlin. In the midst of the chaos that marked the last weeks of the Third Reich, a particular type of combatant appeared among the ruins, the foreign volunteers who were part of the Waffen-SS divisions. Unlike the regular German army, these units were integrated by men coming from diverse countries in Europe, and in some cases, even from other regions. Far from being forced, most had decided to enlist out of ideological conviction or hatred of communism. Their role during the final defense of Berlin was silent, but no less important. Among the first to arrive were the Frenchmen of the Charlemagne division. Hailing from occupied France and active collaborators, these men were sent to reinforce the defense ring of the German capital. They were stationed mainly in the sectors most exposed to the enemy advance, undertaking tasks that required determination and resistance. Their participation did not go unnoticed, as some fought until they ran out of ammunition in the streets near the Reichstag. Beside them were the Norwegians, grouped into small units who knew the urban terrain well, thanks to their previous training. Although there were few of them, their level of commitment was high. They shared with other volunteers a sense of belonging to a cause that, despite being in retreat, was still alive for them. In their view, defending Berlin was protecting Europe from a Soviet invasion they feared more than the German defeat. The Latvians formed one of the most numerous groups. Many of them had witnessed Soviet domination in their country and saw fighting alongside the SS as a way to resist the return of communist control. These units were positioned at critical access points to the city, where close combat was inevitable. Their organization was relatively autonomous, although they coordinated with other German forces to avoid fractures in the defensive lines. No less relevant was the participation of Spaniards, former members of the Blue Division or ideological volunteers, who had remained in Central Europe after the withdrawal of their units. Despite their limited number, they were assigned to high-risk tasks. Some operated in strategic buildings, while others served as liaisons between different positions. Their knowledge of the German language and their prior experience gave them a certain advantage in tactical exchanges. These troops shared the same fate, operating under the direct command of the SS without integrating into the conventional command of the Wehrmacht. Their presence generated tensions among the different military branches, but in the last days of the conflict, these differences were relegated before the necessity of halting the enemy advance. The objective was to maintain control of key areas within the city, such as tunnel entrances, train stations, and access points to the governmental center. The ideological profile of these combatants was diverse, but converged on one point: all rejected communism. Some had grown up in contexts where the Soviet threat was a nearby reality, such as the Baltics or the Romanians. Others, such as the Flemish or the Croatians, had been indoctrinated in nationalist movements that found an echo in the Nazi discourse. Despite the differences in language and culture, they managed to develop a sense of common mission. The internal organization of these units was flexible. Hierarchies adapted to the availability of personnel and the urgency of the situation. Many German SS officers assumed the coordination of mixed groups, combining nationalities in the same detachment. The lack of resources forced improvised decisions, such as the shared use of weapons or the constant relocation of positions. The chaos of the final days altered the traditional military logic. There was no clear front line nor a defined rear. The foreign troops, like the German soldiers, moved through the city looking for defensive spaces that could resist for at least a few more hours. Some sectors were successfully defended for days, thanks to the tenacity of these groups and their prior knowledge of urban tactics. Communications were limited, so many detachments acted semi-independently. They used short-range radios, messengers, and, in some cases, were guided by the sound of the bombings to anticipate movements. Discipline was maintained more by commitment than by imposition. The feeling of having come this far pushed them to resist, even though they knew victory was unattainable. Nazi propaganda had presented these combatants as an example of European unity against Bolshevism. In practice, many were marginalized by the more traditional army cadres. However, in the context of total collapse, any reinforcement was welcome. The orders were clear: hold out as long as possible, defend every block, prevent the enemy from taking symbolic buildings. As the situation worsened, some groups were regrouped in the city center. The presence of foreigners in points near the command bunker was viewed with suspicion, but their effectiveness in combat allowed them to act without major restrictions. They did not have access to the high command, but received precise instructions through designated liaisons. Casualties were high. There were no replacements, and the wounded were often left abandoned at their posts. Even so, an informal record of positions and available men was maintained. Some took turns resting, even if it was in the basements of destroyed buildings. Food was scarce, and ammunition was redistributed among units with lower firepower. Night was the most critical moment. Enemy incursions intensified, and visibility complicated the defense. The foreign volunteers took turns at guard posts, attentive to any sound or movement. The silence between combat was unsettling, but it served to reorganize and plan the next resistance. In the last 3 days of combat, several groups were displaced to key positions around the Ministry of Aviation and other buildings near the center. There they fought in extreme conditions, amidst rubble, smoke and crossfire. Their names were not recorded in many reports, but their resistance prolonged the final fall by hours. This invisible army did not parade in formations nor appear in the last photos of the battle. There were no medals or speeches for them. They were isolated combatants, organized in urgency, defending a cause they knew was lost. Their presence in Berlin was brief but intense, and their history was dissolved among the fragments of a regime in ruins. Resist until the last scream, the center was filled with blood and smoke. The streets of Berlin transformed into a battlefield without defined limits, where every collapsed structure offered defensive opportunities and every corner hid possible threats. The city had ceased being an administrative core to become a labyrinth of ruins, smoke and constant fire. The advance of the armies was not measured in kilometers, but in meters gained with difficulty. The clashes took place inside homes, offices, factories and stations, and the notion of a front line blurred in an urban conflict that branched out uncontrollably across all sectors. The German defenders used the remains of buildings as improvised fortifications, creating scattered and unexpected points of resistance. Abandoned factories became temporary defensive posts, interior stairs became ideal positions for snipers, and hallways transformed into ambush corridors. In places like Alexanderplatz, the surroundings of the zoo, and the vicinity of the Reichstag, the fighting was particularly intense, with control of the area changing hands in a matter of hours. The Panzerfaust became one of the most common weapons among German combatants. Its simple handling and its destructive capability against armored vehicles made it ideal for narrow, debris-filled streets. From basements or behind collapsed walls, the soldiers waited for the right moment to shoot and disappear. Every successful attack provoked immediate reprisals, and often the Soviet response consisted of completely demolishing the building from which the shot had been fired. The Red Army's artillery roared incessantly, with explosions affecting both the combatants and the retreat corridors. Cover in the urban terrain was partial and unstable. Many soldiers moved between open spaces without protection, under the constant risk of being hit. Columns of smoke mixed with the dust raised by the collapses, creating an almost unbreathable environment and reduced visibility. Every street crossing represented a new threat. The advance was so difficult that it sometimes took hours to secure a single block of buildings. Floor by floor, room by room, the soldiers had to check cautiously, alert to any trap or enemy presence. Improvised barricades with furniture, bricks or collapsed beams reinforced the internal defense of many buildings. From the heights, the snipers selected their targets from destroyed attics or partially collapsed roofs. Every impact temporarily paralyzed the Soviet advance, forcing the reorganization of formations and routes. Some of these shooters spent entire days hidden, barely moving or making a sound, waiting for the opportunity for a decisive shot. The Reichstag emerged as one of the most disputed symbols. Although it no longer had real administrative value, its symbolic weight made it a central objective. Its damaged columns and internal halls were defended with all kinds of weapons: machine guns, grenades, rifles, and improvised traps. The clashes on its stairways were brutal, and every metre gained cost tens of lives. The use of portable howitzers, grenade launchers and contact explosives was constant. Hand-to-hand combat intensified inside dark hallways and rooms where the sound of gunshots multiplied with the echo. Often the clashes ended with bladed weapons or with their bare hands when there were no more bullets or space to maneuver. The physical conditions of the combatants were deplorable. Without time to sleep or resupply, many had gone days without food or potable water. Their clothing was torn, covered in dust and soot, and the cold crept in everywhere. Communication between units was intermittent, the radios failed, and messages had to be transmitted in person, exposing the messengers to constant fire. Abandoned train stations, educational centres and government buildings also became strategic defence points. The combatants oriented themselves with old maps or simply with prior knowledge of the terrain, although many accesses were blocked by debris or enemy fire. Alternative routes were often opened through courtyards, sewers or collapsed gaps. With the passing of the days, the urban landscape was increasingly unrecognisable. Facades crumbled, streets were covered in craters, and roofs collapsed without warning. Disabled vehicles blocked key accesses, and the wounded were trapped with no possibility of evacuation. Planks, doors or blankets were used as improvised stretchers, or comrades were simply dragged to where they could receive some protection. Desperation permeated every alley. The noise of the weapons, the voices, the explosions, and the persistent smell of fire and gunpowder created an oppressive atmosphere. Most of the combatants were not fighting with the hope of victory, but out of inertia or fear of punishment. Many were completely unaware of the general situation of the conflict or the location of the enemy. The emotional exhaustion was added to the physical. Anxiety from the nocturnal bombings, extreme fatigue and isolation caused many to enter an almost automatic state. There were soldiers who had not spoken to anyone in days, who maintained their post like automatons, waiting for orders that might not arrive. The end of the combat did not occur uniformly. Some sectors resisted until the absolute exhaustion of resources, while others surrendered when the key defences were broken. However, in multiple corners of Berlin, even in the last moments, the fighting continued intensely. The metallic sound of the shots, the screams muffled by the debris, and the whistle of the artillery marked the final instance of a city reduced to ruins. This urban battle, intense and disordered, would be recorded as one of the fiercest of the century. The last pockets of resistance became dead-end traps. Those who were surrounded could not expect help or evacuation. They resisted out of habit, desperation, or meaningless orders. Time had lost its logic. One day could seem like 1 week. Amidst the dust and the corpses, some wrote hasty notes or scribbled messages on the walls, knowing there would be no other opportunity. Dead-end tunnels, the subway that swallowed thousands beneath Berlin. The Berlin subway system, originally conceived to connect millions of people during peacetime, transformed into an unexpected scene of chaos during the last weeks of the war. Amidst the city's disintegration, these dark tunnels began to fill with exhausted combatants, entire families seeking refuge, and officers without clear communication. The underground became the last resort for those trying to escape the crossfire on the surface, unaware that this refuge would soon become a lethal trap. The galleries and passages connecting stations were occupied in an improvised manner. There was no evacuation plan or centralized control of entrances and exits. The trains had stopped running, but their tracks were used for movement on foot. Some platforms were so crowded that there was barely room to sit. Families settled in groups, surrounded by suitcases, blankets, and bundles. The walls vibrated with every distant explosion, and the floor trembled underfoot. Lamps flickered or went dark, and oxygen began to run low as the hours passed. Rumors circulated rapidly. Some spoke of an imminent Soviet offensive underground. Others mentioned sabotage planned by the German authorities themselves. The idea of a massive flood started as a whisper that few believed, but it gained strength among those who noticed the slow but constant rise of the water level. What began as a puddle in a corner transformed into a torrent descending from the upper areas. There is no clear consensus on the exact origin of the disaster. Some sources indicate that the floodgates were opened by mistake, others that it was a deliberate action to stop the enemy advance underground. In any case, the consequences were immediate. The water quickly flooded the main tunnels, dragging belongings, bodies, and remnants of infrastructure. The lowest stations were under several meters of water in a matter of minutes. The confusion among those present was total. No one knew where to go or how to escape. Children cried, the elderly collapsed, and the wounded who had been moved there for safety were completely trapped. Some tried to swim or climb the stairs to the surface, only to find blocked exits or bombed areas. The combatants who were retreating towards the city centre were also affected. There were German troops regrouping in key stations, but the overflow of water disorganized their plans. Many of them were forced to abandon positions and equipment. In the midst of the panic, priorities changed. It was no longer a matter of resisting, but of surviving. It is estimated that several thousands of people died by drowning or crushing during the first moments of the underground deluge. The exact figures were never confirmed, as many bodies were never recovered. Those who managed to escape spoke of unbearable scenes. People pushing each other in the darkness, screams being silenced under the water, and metal doors closing with no possibility of being opened. Some sections of the subway resisted longer. There, the refugees improvised barriers with what they could find: benches, planks, furniture salvaged from the street. Passageways were sealed with wet blankets or pieces of wood, attempting to stop the water from entering. But it was a desperate effort. The liquid seeped through cracks, rose through the drains, descended the stairs, and formed currents inside the stopped train cars. The situation was aggravated by the lack of communication. There were no operational radios or commanding officers who could organize an orderly evacuation. Each group acted on its own, and decisions were made instantly. Some people chose to stay and wait for the water level to drop. Others decided to move, even if it meant going out to the surface in the middle of the bombardment. Very few succeeded without consequences. The escape routes were confusing. Many refugees did not know the exact layout of the subway. They walked through dark sections without knowing if they were heading towards an exit or a section already flooded. Some were guided by the noise or the current of the water. Others simply followed the closest group, hoping that someone knew where to go. At certain points, desperation led to extreme decisions. Scenes were reported where entire groups forced blocked entrances, knocked down doors, or broke through thin walls with improvised tools, all with the hope of finding air or an alternate path. On occasions, that effort only led to more dangerous areas. The humidity became an additional enemy. Diseases began to spread among those who remained underground. Wounds could not be treated correctly, food was scarce, and potable water was impossible to find. Many began to hallucinate due to fatigue and lack of oxygen. Some survivors recounted that the darkness was the most terrifying thing. Not seeing the face of those next to you, not knowing if the next step would lead you to the water or to a fall. Sounds were distorted, and orientation was easily lost. There were those who shouted the name of a family member, and others mistakenly answered from the other end, causing confusion. The consequences of the disaster were not limited to the immediate moment. Days later, when the surface had already been taken and the fighting ceased, the recovery efforts in the subway revealed the magnitude of the tragedy. Floating train cars, collapsed walls, and hundreds of unidentified bodies. The authorities took weeks to clean some sections. Others were completely abandoned. The psychological impact was also profound. For many Berliners, the subway went from being an everyday space to a place associated with fear and death. Some never used it again, even years later. The stories were transmitted between generations, and the episode of the underground deluge remained etched as one of the darkest in the city's memory. In the middle of the flooded tunnels, some combatants who had lost contact with their superiors tried to improvise new meeting points. The isolation and the impossibility of receiving orders caused erratic decisions. Groups of 10-15 men formed, retreating into partially dry sectors, waiting for a counter-order that would never arrive. Demoralization was accentuated when they discovered that the paths back were completely blocked. The subway was transforming not only into a trap, but also into a prison. Furthermore, the flooding completely cut off strategic underground transport routes that the command expected to keep operational. In their desperation, some units tried to pump out the water without success. Others tried to seek access to technical areas, thinking that from there they could divert the flow. They did not have plans nor technical knowledge. Everything was a mixture of intuition, hope, and accumulated desperation. Several of the corpses that were later found showed signs of having died due to the extreme temperature and not from direct immersion. The freezing cold of the environment, the forced immobility, and prolonged exposure to the wet environment were equally deadly. Berlin's subterranean network transformed, for an incalculable number of people, into a silent and gloomy cemetery. Each flooded area evidenced the complete collapse of a city without direction, of a regime that was crumbling from its innermost foundations. The Body as Border, Diary of a Broken Woman. The arrival of the Red Army in Berlin radically transformed the reality of thousands of German women. The city was on the verge of collapse without an effective defensive structure or military coordination. In that vacuum of authority, a new form of horror emerged. Not the one that appears on the battlefront, but an intimate and daily one, which manifested in dark corners, poorly lit staircases, and rooms where security no longer existed. The first nights of the occupation were lived as a mixture of paralyzing fear and bewilderment. Women of all ages hid in basements, dressed in what they could find, trying to disguise their appearance with soot or dirty clothes to feign illness or older age. Rumors spread quickly through the hallways. Those who were discovered were usually violated, regardless of age, physical condition, or state of health. The threat did not come with visible insignia or official orders, but wrapped in the absolute chaos of a city adrift. In that hostile environment, the diary of a woman who lived through those days became one of the harshest and most revealing testimonies of the human collapse. Written without grandiloquence, without unnecessary dramatization, it harshly reflects the emotional emptiness that seized many. Each entry is a sign of the constant struggle to maintain some dignity amidst the humiliation. Sexual violence became commonplace. It was not just a physical matter, but a systematic destruction of the body and identity. What had been an organized city became a scene of constant fear. Many women were forced to establish ties with Soviet soldiers. These were not relationships in the usual sense, but a way to ensure some protection against others worse. A kind of tacit pact in which the constant presence of one man in the home implied less risk of mass violations. Women learned to negotiate their own survival, using their own bodies as currency. That left a silent mark that was not erased with the end of the conflict. Fear was installed as a permanent presence. Doors no longer offered security. Walls did not stop the screams. In some cases, the neighbors themselves took turns standing guard, not out of bravery but out of desperation. It was known that at any moment an armed group could appear and force entry. The basements, which previously served as air raid shelters, transformed into spaces of contained anguish. Dozens of women and girls took refuge there, embracing in silence, holding back their tears. The diary details the way in which the abuses generated a type of progressive resignation. At first, many resisted, hid or tried to negotiate, but as the days passed, physical and mental exhaustion led them to assume that violence as part of the routine. The language of the diary changes, moving from surprise to disillusionment and then to a calculated coldness. The narrator no longer asks why, but when it will happen again, and the clock becomes an enemy that marks the moments when one must lower their voice, avoid direct eye contact, or prepare some food for the soldier who has settled in the house. The most disturbing thing was not only the violence, but the lack of alternatives. There was no one to turn to. The German authorities had disappeared or were as paralyzed as the civilian population. The new occupants did not distinguish between combatants and citizens. In that total absence of justice or protection, the German woman was exposed to an unnamed form of war, one that was not waged with rifles but with daily acts of dominance and submission. Several women sought to flee to rural areas, although the access points were plagued with checkpoints. Some chose to disguise themselves as elderly people, feign physical ailments, or adopt the role of domestic employees. No strategy offered guarantees. The threat of being handed over was always present, since the very neighbors with whom food was previously shared could become informers, moved by fear or self-interest. Fear ended up nullifying any reasoning. The imposed relationships with soldiers did not always adopt openly violent forms. On occasion, they appeared as kind gestures. Some soldiers offered provisions, promises of shelter or cigarettes. However, the basis of these interactions was invariable, an unequal bond conditioned by the dominant position of the occupant. The woman, without real possibilities of decision, accepted with the sole purpose of staying alive, which added a burden of guilt to the already accumulated suffering. Silence was the most common tool. What happened was not discussed even among friends or in the family environment. The physical marks were hidden under clothing, while the feelings were buried along with the city's debris. Many never spoke of it again. Some chose to write, as the author of the diary did. However, even in those pages, the gaps persist. Days without annotations, cut short phrases, thoughts that never finish. Emotional survival was built on routine, preparing tea, tidying the debris, taking care of a neighbor. Every daily gesture became an act of silent resistance. Some women began to keep lists of what there was, of what was missing, of what had to be done the next day. It was not for organization, but out of a need for control. When everything collapses, writing a list is a way to affirm oneself. In some cases, women formed small mutual aid communities. They shared food, guarded entrances, and took turns looking after the children. It was a way to keep from going crazy, to keep alive the feeling that something still remained human. But even those networks were fragile. All it took was a scream, an unexpected visit, for everything to crumble again. The diary also speaks of guilt, not only the one they felt for having survived, but the one that came from remembering how, a while back, some had benefited from the regime. There was an uncomfortable awareness that this war had also been encouraged by many ordinary citizens. And now the price was being paid by the women's bodies. That idea ran through their thoughts without needing to be said. As the weeks passed, the narrator develops a distant look. There is no longer any alarm at the sounds or surprise at the threats. Everything becomes a ritual. They learn when to speak and when to be silent, which gestures to avoid, which words to use. The instinct of survival becomes the sole engine. Even moments of tenderness, when they occurred, were marked by suspicion and fear. Older women tried to protect the young ones. They disguised them, hid them, had them pose as maids or sick daughters. In some cases, they succeeded. In others, everything ended with screams and broken doors. The cycle repeated, over and over again. The diary of a broken woman is not a heroic testimony. There are no great deeds or open acts of rebellion. What there is quiet resistance, silent strategies for not giving up completely. And there is pain. A pain that does not seek solace, but understanding. The testimony acquires its strength precisely because of that, because it does not exaggerate, does not embellish, does not dramatize. It is a direct voice from the abyss, a voice that speaks of what many lived through and few could tell. A voice that, despite the fear, decided to write. That way of writing, disorganized and at times difficult to follow, functions as an emotional reflection of a city destroyed from its deepest core. Every part of the diary reflects what thousands silenced, what they could never put in writing. Upon reading it, one not only understands what happened, but also perceives that silence that everyone shared, that internal burden that many carried, that way of resisting without anyone seeing or acknowledging it. Even when the occupation ended, those days remained present in their eyes, in their customs, in the way they expressed themselves. What was left unsaid weighed in the atmosphere. The pain moved without being named. The diary remained as proof that someone was there, that someone lived it, that they managed to move forward, even though they would never be the same. The last act of Nazi power. The bunker beneath the Chancellery in Berlin, where Adolf Hitler took refuge in the last days of the Third Reich, was not just an air raid shelter. It became the final stage for desperate decisions, final pacts, and carefully prepared rituals. While the city fell apart under enemy fire, the end of Nazi power was sealed inside that subterranean space. There were no public farewells or solemn words. Everything was executed with precision, almost as if following a script, knowing that they were witnessing the closing of a gloomy period. Adolf Hitler, in his last days, no longer had contact with reality. The reports he received were distorted to satisfy his desire for total resistance. His orders lacked operational logic, but no one dared to contradict him. The bunker operated with a forced routine, meal times, documents he signed, and meetings without military sense. Despite the increasingly close roar of Soviet projectiles, they tried to feign normality. Eva Braun decided to stay with him despite knowing what was approaching. She maintained a certain calm and dedicated herself to daily tasks. She dressed meticulously, spoke of trivial matters, and avoided mentioning the chaos outside. Although their relationship had been private for years, in that last week they formalized it with a brief marriage celebrated inside the bunker. Her permanence was not accidental, but a conscious choice to share her partner's fate. The preparations for the inevitable were organized without improvisation. Hitler verified methods, left clear instructions about what should be done afterward, and communicated his decision to his closest circle. When the moment arrived, both retreated to a room. Minutes later, a dull sound alerted those present. When they entered, they found the scene exactly as it had been planned, without witnesses or words. In that same underground space, Joseph and Magda Goebbels also made decisions that would link them to the outcome of that closed environment. He chose to remain in the city, assuming the consequences. She, convinced that her children would not fit into a world that no longer shared the beliefs with which they had been raised, acted with an unsettling determination. First, she used a sedative to put them to sleep, and then, amidst absolute silence, she ensured that they did not wake up. What happened was reconstructed later from indirect testimonies, enveloped in a dense atmosphere that no one interrupted. During those days, the atmosphere inside the bunker became denser. Conversations were brief, charged with tension. Some sought escape routes, while others accepted what was coming. Among those who remained, loyalties fragmented. Himmler was seen as a traitor for seeking negotiations. Bormann continued there, although his final fate remains uncertain. There was talk of an escape attempt, but nothing was confirmed with certainty. The place itself was claustrophobic. Narrow corridors, simple rooms, constant artificial lighting and a persistent humidity created an oppressive atmosphere. There were no windows, the air felt heavy, and any noise was amplified. Routines were reduced to the bare minimum, tasteless meals, contentless chats and short walks. Some tried to read or write, others simply waited. Hitler also drafted documents in which he assigned responsibilities and named substitutes. He kept his vision intact until the end, blaming others for the situation. His words had a tone of command that no longer corresponded to reality. The collapse was total. Outside the bunker, Soviet troops advanced without pause. Inside, the regime was dissolving. The last decisions made by those closest to power aimed to maintain an appearance of control in the face of the inevitable. No closing speeches were made, nor were there solemn signals. They merely carried out orders, acted as planned, and allowed the environment to lose life without making noise. Some staff members looked for a way to leave the place without attracting attention, trying to sneak away unseen, while others preferred to hide where they could. Many chose to stay still, waiting in silence without asking questions. There was no hope or space for redemption. The outcome was the reflection of years of closed and irreversible decisions. Within those walls there was no room for reconsideration. Only a reduced group remained, facing the end with no possibility of escape. The way everything concluded was faithful to the style that had marked the regime, direct, inflexible, and without nuances. What happened was part of a premeditated decision, a final act taken by those who were not willing to accept surrender. In that place there were no moving farewells or symbolic acts. Only a thick atmosphere remained, marked by distant echoes and doors that closed quickly. No commemorative scenes were left, only scattered documents, official data, and unoccupied rooms. In the hours following the outcome, confusion reigned. Some of the closest collaborators took care of the last errands, destroying important papers, erasing evidence, or coordinating discreet exits for those who could still flee. Most understood that there was no longer an option to turn back. Among the lower ranks, several tried to blend in with the common troops, adopt different clothing, or get rid of insignias in the hope of going unnoticed. Outside, the noise did not cease, and every explosion made the ground tremble. The heart of Berlin was rapidly crumbling. The seat of the government burned uncontrollably, while the air, saturated with smoke, dust, and melted metal, filtered through the vents. In the confinement underground, the passage of time became blurry and confusing. Every moment brought with it a new sign that everything was getting worse. Inside the bunker, the circle was closing. There were no alternative plans or strategies for the continuity of the regime. Some sought means to communicate with what remained of the military command, but there were no longer safe channels. The lines were cut, and no one answered. The only thing left was the certainty that everything had ended. For the few who managed to leave, the journey was short. Some were detained after a few meters. Others were lost among the debris. Most left no trace. What happened in the bunker was recorded only through fragments, scattered reports, and indirect testimonies. Ruins without a flag, the new fear that gripped Berlin. Following the silence left by the collapse of the bunker, Berlin did not awaken to peace. What followed was not a truce, but an occupation marked by chaos, fear, and a new form of control. The flags changed, but the ruins still stood. From the debris of a ruined city, the Soviet domination began, a time of arrests, repression, looting, and surveillance. The first to appear after the end of the fighting were the NKVD officers. They brought neither aid nor bread, but lists. They were looking for members of the Nazi Party, sympathizers, collaborators, or simply suspects. The arrests were immediate, often without trial, without interrogation, without explanation. Men were dragged from their homes, beaten in the street, or disappeared in the middle of the night. In every block there were rumors, names no one wanted to pronounce, footsteps heard on the staircase at midnight. Fear changed its language, but not its form. Hundreds of testimonies collected by later chroniclers or survivors relate the speed with which the new order was imposed. According to data from archives opened decades later, in a few weeks more than 120,000 arrests had already been made in Berlin and its surroundings. While the Soviet troops settled in public buildings and strategic points, looting began without order or restraint. There were soldiers who stole watches, bicycles, and furniture. Others emptied stores, entered houses, and ripped out doors. In many areas there was no command or law. The city had become an open field for plunder. Objects changed hands every hour. No one knew who owned what. Families hid the little they had left in holes beneath the floor or buried it in gardens, hoping it wouldn't be discovered. Some accounts indicate that even works of art or musical instruments ended up on trains bound for the east. It was a meticulous expropriation, disguised as victory. The fear did not come solely from the soldiers. It also crept through the cracks of everyday life, between neighbors who began to watch each other, convinced that they had to collaborate or inform. Unknown people appeared who acted as if they had authority, attentive to every step, every word. Little by little it became normal not to look at anyone, not to talk to anyone, to avoid any gesture that could be misinterpreted. Greetings disappeared from the doorways. The city, already broken physically, was also breaking internally. Some burned papers as a precaution. Others left without goodbyes, thinking that disappearing was safer. There was always someone watching from a window, someone who remembered who you were or what you had done, and that memory was enough for you to be singled out. At the same time, a new power structure was established. The old signs with slogans of the Third Reich were quickly replaced by posters written in Russian. Notices with different rules began to circulate, and figures designated as new authorities were announced. Censorship soon became visible. Radios were removed, books were banned, and murals were dismantled. Schools were reopened under strict control, where the content was scrutinized. Any element associated with the previous regime was eliminated. The goal was to replace recent memories with a new official narrative. In less than 1 week, more than 30 publications were eliminated. Only those that the Soviet regime approved could be distributed, all with the same focus, imposing discipline, promoting obedience, controlling thought. The landscape offered no rest. Berlin was covered in debris everywhere. The streets were so different from what they had been that no one recognized them. The trams were completely charred, and many facades barely stood. In several sectors there was no trace of running water, and electricity appeared only intermittently. Improvised kitchens used embers collected from the trash, food was prepared in rusty cans, and children ran among the ruins without knowing well what the world they now belonged to meant. According to Red Cross data, more than 40% of all urban infrastructure was completely useless. In the midst of that scenario, division began. Although it was still one city, the Allied powers were already thinking about zones of occupation. The Soviets acted with an advantage. They were on the ground. Their control was immediate and direct. They began to establish their own power structures, with like-minded Germans who repeated the slogans dictated to them. A parallel administration was installed while negotiations with the British, Americans, and French were being prepared. Committees, neighborhood councils, and surveillance groups were organized, appearing everywhere. People were encouraged to report any suspicious behavior, and pointing out others became a sign of commitment to the new power. The German Communist Party, which until recently was clandestine, re-emerged with total support. Several of its former militants moved into local positions without transition. The Soviet structure gradually took shape, adjusted to the destroyed landscape. In some areas, there was even talk of laboratories of socialism, as if each neighborhood were a political experiment in progress. One of the first targets was the archives. Papers, personnel lists, deeds, and various records were taken. The Soviet interest was not only to punish, but to begin controlling. They wanted to know everything: who did what, when, and where. It was not just about revenge, but about cementing a power based on data, names, and backgrounds. Documents began to be worth more than many weapons. Entire boxes of files departed for Moscow with no return. Recent history became a tool for surveillance and control. For the civilian population, every day involved adapting to an unpredictable reality where the value of things had completely transformed. Cigarettes were used as currency, and a watch could be exchanged for a piece of bread. The Russian language gradually mixed with German in daily conversations, while some women chose to establish ties with Soviet soldiers as a way to seek protection against the disorder. Informal agreements were generated, exchanges occurred, and grey areas arose in which the moral lines, once clear, blurred under the pressure of necessity. Personal diaries that have survived the passage of time show repeated phrases like, "Everything is valid if one more survives," a reflection of a logic of subsistence that superseded any other principle. The media was completely taken over. Newspapers stopped circulating until they received approval. Broadcast stations transmitted only what was authorized. There was talk of reconstruction, justice, and new times, but in the neighborhoods, the future looked distant. Every family was busy surviving. Many took refuge in churches, libraries, basements. Others simply wandered. Hunger did not distinguish ideologies. The start of the Cold War was gestated in small gestures. Vigilance posts appeared, restrictions were imposed. The areas controlled by the Allied powers began to delineate increasingly defined limits. Berlin became filled with maps and permits, continuous inspections, and controlled crossings. Children already knew how to recognize the different uniforms and learned not to cross certain streets. The city ceased to feel like a whole to become disconnected fragments, each one watched with suspicion. Although the Iron Curtain had not yet fully descended, the divisions were already underway and felt like a prelude to something bigger. Despite everything, life went on. The ruins offered shelter, collapsed staircases were used as part of daily life, and women improvised communal kitchens to feed their families. While some collected debris trying to bring some order to the streets, others resumed their old trades as best they could, often working with borrowed or deteriorated tools. Libraries, little by little, reopened their doors, although with revised and censored collections. Clandestine markets emerged on every corner where everything had a price. In this context, survival was the only possible form of politics. The Soviet presence was not homogeneous. There were disciplined units, commanders who tried to establish order. But there were also loose groups, soldiers who acted without control, who abused their power. That duality made every bloc different. In one there might be relative calm, in another panic. Some Soviet officers wrote reports concerned about the indiscipline of their troops, but few acted. Churches began to open their doors as meeting points. Some served as shelters, others as places to exchange information. Rumors, lists of missing persons, and news from the front were shared. No one had certainty. The city lived in the continuous present, without knowing when it could speak of the past. The masses were discreet. People prayed more for protection than for faith. The Soviet government assigned some civil delegates in order to display a more institutional image of the new power. Public service offices were launched, pamphlets with rules were distributed, and notices that simulated normality were organized. However, the real control continued in the hands of the military apparatus. Decisions were made directly by Soviet commanders, not by judges or courts. Public hearings were non-existent, only final decisions were announced without allowing participation. The judicial system did not act as such, but functioned as a direct extension of the repressive apparatus. The architecture also reflected who was in charge now. Where Third Reich emblems once waved, red flags now hung. Fallen statues were replaced by monuments celebrating the Soviet victory. Although there was talk of liberation, only exhaustion could be seen on many faces. Streets changed names, some walls appeared covered with slogans written in Cyrillic, and although everything seemed different, most did not feel it as a true change. In the days that followed, the first spaces used as labor camps began to appear. Although they were not officially recognized, they operated effectively. They served to gather those who were considered a threat, silence opponents, and make those who were inconvenient to the new power disappear. Their location was not reported, nor was there a clear way out of them. Control was consolidated away from external view. The few who managed to return rarely spoke. Most simply did not return. In the midst of the dust, the wires and the blackened walls, a different stage began after the end of the war. It did not bring reconstruction, but constant surveillance. There was no talk of hope or what was to come, only of imposed rules. The ruins were not only of brick and concrete, so too were the social fabric and the collective spirit. Berlin did not find freedom with the arrival of the new power. It simply passed from one set of hands to another. The final offensive in Berlin represented the last decisive episode in the European conflict of the Second World War. There, the Soviet armed forces clashed with their full weight against the exhausted but still determined defensive units of the Third Reich in a direct confrontation for control of the German capital. The combat devastated the city and caused an immense number of deaths, but it also marked the definitive collapse of Nazism and the end of its expansionist and racist project. Today, the courage of those who gave their lives in that struggle is remembered, and the will to continue striving for a future based on peace and coexistence is renewed.